Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's March 2nd, 2017, and today we're launching into part 2 of our episode on media freedom in 2017 Myanmar with guests Thomas Keane and Sean Gleeson, both editors at the weekly magazine Frontier Myanmar. Having covered the history of censorship, government ownership and the media landscape in part 1, we're about to launch into just which issues are still sensitive to report on in Myanmar and what happened recently at the Myanmar Times.
Alright, so you've brought up Mongol, so I think it might be a good opportunity to just quickly ask, in regards to censorship / self-censorship, what are the kinds of stories that the press is still restricted or encouraged not to cover, or to cover in a certain way in Myanmar? I can think of the violence in Rakhine states, the civil wars, resource projects, land grabs. What do you think are the really important issues that need to be covered freely that currently face problems in Myanmar?
I think of everything that you've mentioned, Rakhine is far and away the one that provokes kind of the most strident response from the government, from the military. Things like Kachin and Northern Shan, I mean, there's still travel restrictions, there's still perhaps a little bit of blowback. Land seizures seems like it's more when there's a prominent individual involved that it causes some kind of ructions than if, say, it's a military holding company or...
I feel the land disputes and private enterprises and stuff are pretty fair game. Like I think there are kind of limits. It depends, obviously, what you're accusing someone of doing. I mean, if you're saying that they allegedly confiscated land, well, that's just so common here that it doesn't raise an eyelid. I mean, there's not much reputational damage. There's an assumption that yes, they would have done that because everybody did it.
Yeah.
Whereas if you were to accuse them of like high-level corruption, bribing a government official, I mean, that's going to be a different story. So it really depends. I mean, it's like you can talk about corruption in a general sense here, but when you start getting specific, that's when you have issues. And, you know, corruption, there's generally not a lot of evidence left around to substantiate it. So for the media, it's always going to be difficult, especially when you don't have strong institutions to report on corruption. I think that generally private projects are fine. It will be interesting to see if, as we move on, and if 66D being in the telecommunications law, the defamation clause, which applies to anything that's written online, if that starts being used by businesses against people who criticize them. I think there was one case recently. I can't think of too many. It's really, until now, it's been used in situations where there's been a political comment, you know, whether it's aimed at the military or at the NLD or whoever. Generally hasn't involved businesses. So that could have a really chilling effect if that does start to happen.
Totally, and I think it's certainly a strong possibility. I often think about how, another part of your question that you brought up is like where the line's drawn between censorship and self-censorship. And I think there's...
Can I jump in?
Yeah, go for it.
I think it's important to recognize that there are a lot of factors that contribute to self-censorship. I mean, I think probably when it gets talked about in the context of Myanmar, people think it's because of a fear of the government. In some cases, or some situations, government pressure is probably a factor, and military pressure. But, you know, there are a lot of other factors as well. It's pressure from owners, management, editors. There's pressure from the journalist community, pressure from readers, to conform. I think we see this on Rakhine. You know, even journalists who want to report in a balanced way, I think a lot of them feel like it's difficult because their name is on the work, and if they're perceived as being pro-Muslim, pro-Rohingya, pro-Bengali, then, you know, even amongst their friends and family who are not journalists, I mean, that can be a difficult issue, you know, to be labelled with that tag. So it's not just the government and the military that are encouraging self-censorship. There's a lot of different factors.
This might be a good opportunity to move to Sean's article. You recently wrote a detailed attempt to delineate the exact trajectories leading to the exodus of over 20 foreign staff members from the Myanmar Times. Now, your piece, as I read it, is over 5,000 words. So can you summarise it for the audience and explain what happened, how the situation came about, and maybe we should focus here on the fact that we are all foreigners and we're talking about a kind of local foreign split at the paper, as much as it's to do with stuff we're already talking about. But what's your opinion on this divide? Is it a matter of business culture, journalism culture, universals, or something more? And Tom, you approved the story, I assume, and you used to work at Myanmar Times, so please give us your perspective also.
Yes, it is about a split in some ways between the foreign staff and the Myanmar staff in their perspective on, you know, a journalist's role and a publication's role and the kind of its values and what role it should be fulfilling. But I think it's important to understand that it's not necessarily a split between the foreign editors and the Myanmar editors or Myanmar journalists. It's really the management. And I think that the journalists and editors, the Myanmar journalists and editors, they are very much aligned with the thinking of the foreign staff who work at the paper. The majority of them. That's been my experience. And I left Myanmar Times in April 2016, which is sort of where Sean's article picks up. But there had also been a lot of tensions on the Myanmar language edition before that. Quite a few editors were fired or sort of forced to resign. New editors with a background at the state newspaper were brought in. And I should add that although I approved the story, I wasn't really involved in the production of it. I think we kind of made a conscious decision that, for example, our owner, Sunny Sway, who was the co-founder of Myanmar Times, he was not involved in the article. I was involved only at sort of at the end in the production part of it, because, you know, we have such an attachment to the Myanmar Times that it would have been hard to be involved in that article. I think
it's true to say that there is a great deal of solidarity between Western editors and their Myanmar counterparts, whether they're editors, photographers, reporters, other members of the editorial staff. Another thing I didn't mention about the tensions between Myanmar editorial staff and the board, in addition to what Tom said about the events kind of immediately before the election, bringing in kind of Ministry of Information lifers, there was the establishment of the Myanmar language daily edition of the Myanmar Times at the beginning of this year. This was all kind of happening in the final months of last year. The staff had no forewarning about it. They had no announcements, and that lack of communication from the board, from senior management, left them rather fearing for their jobs as well. The broad things about the way in which people who'd worked there for a very long time had their position terminated in the aftermath of that was something that was very keenly felt and left them feeling like their positions were a lot more precarious. It's certainly, from the conversations that I've had with both Myanmar people on staff and former foreign staffers, certainly made an impact in the sense that reporters were a lot less forthcoming when it came to presenting details in their articles to editors. Had to be coaxed out. But you also asked for a summary, and I haven't given that. So I guess if I were to summarize that very briefly, in the last year or more, probably more like the last 18 months, there was a concerted effort on behalf of the board of Myanmar Consolidated Media, which owns the Myanmar Times, to rein in the coverage a little, to, I suppose, in its most broad sense, to soften it up a bit, to be less contentious and to expose the paper to marginally less risk when it came to covering conflict, when it came to covering stories out of Rakhine. And at the same time, a concurrent program that was underway by the board was to reduce the commercial operating costs at the Times. And that's despite the fact that, to my knowledge, Myanmar Consolidated Media has never run at a loss. It had healthy operating profit figures for 2015, and it was becoming more and more highly regarded after a very controversial history. It had won a bunch of regional publishing awards. It boasted some of the best journalistic talent in the country. You look at any media organization that's printing in English, they'll all boast members from the staff of the Myanmar Times. They are role models to their colleagues. They are professional. They are inculcated. And this all happened at a time when there was no formal media training for journalists. So while things are potentially looking up for the Myanmar Times, and I think there is a possibility that some of the kind of dramatic changes that have happened in the last year will turn around, I think it's a big blow to an organisation which in many respects has led the way on changes in the media industry here and in setting the standard for professional reporting. And I think it's given a lot of people pause. A lot of people are sad about it, and we hope for things to get better. So,
I mean, I think there's definitely a lot more optimism at the Myanmar Times since Kawi was appointed as editor-in-chief.
He's a very established journalist. Right?
Yeah, and I mean, he's from Thailand, but he has a very high profile in Myanmar. He's been involved in a lot of Myanmar development, like journalism development work. A lot of journalists will know him. The good news is, I think that Myanmar Times has retained most of its good Myanmar journalists all through this kind of upheaval. So it will make it easier to I suppose rebuild a bit, because to be frank, it's easier to hire foreign journalists than Myanmar journalists that have the skills that you need, because there aren't many journalism training programs in Myanmar. The ones that are there are relatively new. So I mean, there's optimism. A lot will depend. I think Sean's article makes clear on the relationship between Kawi and the board. I think one interesting point, which I just heard from some friends who work there, as one critique of the article is that it came across to them as like too personal, maybe. And what I read from that comment is that the style of the article, which is very like fly on the wall, you know, a lot of it's about meetings that were going on, and it's a style that we're used to. But I think in Myanmar journalism, it's not widely used as a reporting technique. You know, I know some of them were like, well, it's not really journalism. It's like it's too personal. But you know, if you read like long form narrative journalism, the best of it is when it really takes you into, you know, whatever is being reported on, whether it's a business or in the government. But I think that it was just really interesting for me to see that different conception of what journalism is and what it isn't, and probably reflects some of the tensions within the article. I think also when I say that there's a lot of solidarity between the Myanmar editorial staff and the expatriate staff who are working at Myanmar Times, it's not like you see eye to eye on every issue.
Yeah.
I think like there would be some who are uncomfortable about the coverage of Rakhine State, for example. But on the whole, I think most recognize that the expatriate staff who are working at Myanmar Times are a positive force for the newspaper, and that maybe, you know, you just had to accept that at times there were going to be things that you didn't agree on.
I think as a foreigner living and working in Myanmar, whether you're in the media industry or otherwise, there needs to be what I guess is almost a dialectic process of reconciling your own values and your own understanding with prevailing attitudes in the place that you find yourself. And I think that should be true everywhere. I think it's something that's especially keenly felt here for a variety of reasons. I think it's important to spend a lot of time considering it and to yield to the possibility that your own values and your own understanding, philosophy, outlook is often going to be vastly different to your colleagues, your friends, your neighbors, and understanding that, empathizing with that, and treating it as a learning opportunity in every circumstance is really the only useful way to live with that. And I think especially in a newsroom, in my opinion, having worked for a few outlets now in my career, the best news organizations are the ones that encourage a constant dialogue, debate, disagreement, argument between reporters and editors, between editors and management. And I think that should be no exception here. And I think as editors, we have to recognize the limits of our own understanding and come to some sort of accord with that.
Great, I think that's an excellent way to finish up and worth striving for, all of us. But what I always do at the end of these podcasts is I ask the guests to make a recommendation, one each. It can be anything you like. It can be a film, an article, food, a place to travel to, as long as it's about Myanmar. So maybe, Tom, do you want to go first?
I was hoping Sean would have the honour. So mine's more of a practical recommendation for foreigners who are living in Yangon, and it is Pro One, the Bunnings hardware shop. Right? Yeah, there's one on Upper Pusindown Road. There's one in Mingaladon.
Oh, Pro One. I thought you were talking Promart.
No, not Promart. Pro One.
Oh man,
it will save you so much time. And
as a man building his house currently.
Yeah, building a house. But even if a friend was saying to me, he's like, my toilet broke. I needed one small piece of plastic. I wasted a whole day going to Plastic Street in downtown and being sent from one area of the city to another when I could have just gone to Pro One. So that is my recommendation. I thought about books and movies and so on, and nothing came to mind. So
don't get lamps there. They're ugly as sin, though. Don't sue me, Pro One.
There's a lot of junk. I mean, let's be honest. But
yeah.
There's a lot of stuff, so you might find something that is actually useful there.
As an Australian used to ubiquitous Bunnings on every street corner, it looks like it's a precedent, right? And there is something alluring about it. This big box hardware dream.
I mean, my first reaction when I walked in was just a sigh of relief, to be honest. I felt like I'd been transported somewhere. I have mixed feelings about it. I mean...
Wouldn't mind a sausage sizzle out the front every Saturday.
But then I wouldn't leave. That would be the problem. It is... You can kind of see in it the death of the small retailer at some distant point in the future. But what gives me heart is that when I mention it to a lot of Myanmar people, they're like, oh, too expensive. And so they'll still be going to Tile Street, still be going to Paint Street because...
Blue PVC Piping Street.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas I'll be going to Pro One because it's slightly more expensive but much more convenient.
Oh, the convenience.
Yeah. So, but for expatriates who are moving to Yangon, that might be a helpful recommendation.
Heartening too.
Can you give us something more cerebral, just to balance?
I don't know about cerebral, but talking about my article, I highly recommend everyone who's interested in the media in Myanmar to go onto YouTube and watch Dancing with Dictators, which I mentioned in my article, in which Tom has a very special cameo appearance. I can attest that he still looks just as young and fresh-faced today as he did, whatever it was, 6 years ago.
He is a married man, careful.
Yeah.
Yeah,
sorry, ladies, he's
taking.
It's compelling. It's so fascinating. It's cinema verite at its best. Unfortunately, it's a slightly shorter cut. I think it was done for TV. There's another feature which I saw probably like 5 years ago that's like 20 minutes longer. So you don't get to see Ross Dunkley in a gold kimono.
Oh, that got cut from the TV version?
It did, yeah.
That was my favourite part.
Yeah, he's like smoking a ciggy, I think, wearing a gold kimono, packing these brown paper envelopes full of money to get onto a plane to Bangkok. And like, cool as a cucumber, like it's the most normal thing in the world. But great interviews, great coverage of the Myanmar Times team during the 2010 elections and everything that was about. The dispute with Dr. Tintanu. Is he a doctor? I don't know. Tintanu.
No comment.
Okay. I urge everyone to watch it.
I saw this film sometime close to its release and not since, so I would love to go back and revisit it. I didn't even think that it might be on YouTube.
Yeah. It still cracks me up. I mean, that's a bit glib. There's a lot of serious stuff, but there's a lot of funny moments too.
There are a few funny moments.
Wonderful. Well, 2 great recommendations. Thanks, guys. Thanks for coming on to Myanmar Musings, and hopefully we'll have you here again.
My pleasure, Luke. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke.